I am Laurie Cochenour from the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a senior instructional designer with Pitt Online. Today, the topic is making decisions about accessibility. I'm going to talk about accessibility, why it's important, why we need to be doing it, how to do it well, how to make decisions about accessibility, and introduce a tool that might be helpful for you to use when thinking about how to do this. I want to thank Stephanie for inviting me. And if you just let me know that you can hear me, that would be helpful. And I will get started. Just this week, ELI put out key issues in teaching and learning. And one of the key issues, number 2 on the list, was accessibility and universal design for learning, which I think are interconnected. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those. I will tell you that I come at this from a very practical standpoint. Earlier in my career, I worked with young children with hearing loss. And I started working with those families when their children were first identified with hearing loss. And it happened that several of the families that I worked with continued to stay in touch with me at various milestones throughout their students' careers. And one of them came to the university where I was working after I left that field, and she had a lot of difficulty getting the services that she needed provided to her through the university. So I was really interested in how residential students were doing with accessibility and how the university was providing accessible materials to students. And then I started working online, and that's how I began to research more and more about making instructional materials accessible to students from a variety of different perspectives. In case you don't know, there are 4 major laws that have to do with disability awareness and accessibility. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1973, which really was the Civil Rights Act for peoples with disabilities. And it had a lot to do with access to buildings and other kinds of physical access to entertainment areas and closed captioning for television. And you'll remember what that was like when people's hair was on fire about whether or not they were going to have to install elevators in all of the university buildings and whatnot. In 1990, the Americans with Disability Act came into being, and this is what is referred to as the ADA, and that prohibits discrimination and promotes inclusion for people with a varying range of disabilities. And then in 1998, Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act came into law, and that was an amendment that was specifically about ensuring use of electronic and information technology for people with disabilities. And this is really, in 1998, was when distance education, the World Wide Web, email, all of those things were kind of happening at the same time. And the advocates for peoples with disability really became vocal and went to their representatives about the problems encountered by folks with low vision or hearing loss or physical disabilities, and how that impeded access to materials on the web and materials that were provided in an educational setting. In 2008, the ADA amendments were signed into law, and a broader definition of disability was introduced. And that's where we came to understand um, that we needed to be inclusive regarding folks who had attention deficit disorder or who had mental illness, and not just physical disabilities, but all kinds of different disabilities. And so that brings us to this fancy little tool that we created at Pitt. And this impact effort matrix, as we refer to it, was something that we came up with several years ago in working with our director of disability services and a student at Pitt who used a screen reader, had to rely on a screen reader to get information. He was in a master's program at the time. And what we wanted to know really was where to put our effort. What should we prioritize? What was going to be expensive? And how could we make a decision that gave us our biggest bang for the buck, or that wasn't going to require us to completely redo every course that we had in order to make all of our materials available and accessible to students. This tool, and you'll see this matrix was developed by us 5 years ago now. We just have looked at it and changed a few things. We got rid of something, we added something new. So this is in flux, and our matrix isn't necessarily going to look like your matrix. So you have to think about the time, the financial resources, the people power that you have in order to enact these different elements of accessibility. And these are things that are commonly required by the federal government in order to consider something accessible by a large group. These elements are true whether you're talking about instructional course materials, which is what we focus on, but it's also true for websites, and you'll see more and more that people are changing their websites, and the reason for that is because they're paying much more attention now to the elements of accessibility when creating websites, so that we're not building something new, which we know we're going to have to go in and change in a few years' time. And in fact, because there had been some very big lawsuits involving very large universities who are and have been involved with distance education and online education for quite a while, more and more people have become aware of the law and what it takes to make something accessible. But what I'd like to emphasize, and I am not an attorney and I don't play one on television, all of this information is information that you can get yourself on the web anywhere, but you have to dig for it. And but it is come by via lots of experience, and hard-won experience at that. And what I want to say is that you should not be concerned about, as we were, about going back and redoing every course that you've ever developed in order to make everything in those courses accessible. Instead, what you need to be aware of is that moving forward, you should keep these elements in mind and make each document, each web page, each website, each online course as accessible as possible. I do know that the federal government, the Office of Civil Rights, looks very closely at whether or not due diligence has been done when looking at accessibility. In other words, are you thinking about these topics? Do you have a policy written for your university or university system? Is it posted? Do students know where to go when they need assistance? Those kinds of things are very, very important. Now I'm going to talk about each of these elements a little bit. I don't want to go into great detail, but I do want you to know that all of this information will be made available to you through my slides and also on the Pitt Online and Center for Teaching and Learning at Pitt website. So you'll have lots of opportunity to take a good long look at all of this. So hyperlinks. We decided that hyperlinks had a high impact for students and were relatively low effort. What that means is, I have a couple of questions, so I want to address those. When you talk about accessibility, are you referring more to information, awareness, socioeconomics, disability, or all of the above? Really, all of the above. The idea of difference, and I'm going to address this when I talk about universal design, has become more and more clear over time. So people are interested in addressing gender, sexuality, socioeconomics, disability. All of those things cannot be addressed with one law or one set of standards, but we certainly want to keep them all in mind when we're talking about these issues. Thanks for that question. So, hyperlinks. When I'm talking about hyperlinks, I'm referring to links that are used to take students to another page when they click on it. And if you click on the table that I was just showing you, it will take you to the Pitt webpage where we explain exactly what hyperlinks are, why we rated them the way we did, and where you can find out more information about making hyperlinks and your websites and web pages and instructional materials more accessible to students. I see lots of times when I'm reviewing courses, I will see a long string of a URL, which doesn't tell me anything about what's actually going to be on that page when I reach it. Not only that, but if you have someone who is relying on a screen reader and they come across that long string of numbers and letters and sometimes text, the screen reader will read that entire line of numbers and text. It doesn't automatically take the student or user to that place where you hope they'll be, and they really have no idea what it is that you're trying to get them to look at. So the idea of hyperlinks is that you make the name of the link meaningful. So instead of saying click here, you say the name of the journal article that you want students to review, or the name of the website that you want them to go to. All of that is helpful information for students, not just who use screen readers, but who are browsing up and down your page or document or your Blackboard site or some other place where students are getting content. So hyperlinks are really important. I still see lots of bad ones, and it's not that hard to change them. More and more Word and other document creation tools are making it very easy to create a link. The next element I want to talk about is readable PDFs. And this again has to do with students who are using a screen reader. A screen reader cannot read a PDF as they are currently created, because it requires that an image be taken of the document. That's what a PDF is. It's an image. And a screen reader cannot read an image. It needs text. So you have to create a PDF that is readable to the screen reader in order for someone relying on the screen reader to be able to get to that content. Again, this is a very high impact element, and it takes very little effort now to translate PDFs into readable PDFs. There are lots of programs out there that help you do that. We at Pitt have a program called Census Access that we pay for that allows you to just download your document and your PDF, and it re-uploads it as a readable PDF. That sounds really simple, but it really does take a little bit of thought and awareness, again, to use that word, in order to make sure that students have access to the materials that are required for learning in the course. The biggest thing is that we don't want any of these things to get in the students' way of learning and accessing the materials that they need to be successful. Font color. Font color is a challenge for someone who is colorblind, or if they're using a screen reader. It can be difficult for individuals to understand what the meaning of the color is. So for emphasis, instead of using font color, you might want to use a bold or an italics instead. I see lots of course websites that have interesting font colors all over the place, and I think that's because many of us grew up with a red pen, and we think that that's a meaningful thing, but it doesn't hold the same meaning to us as it does to students from other cultures sometimes. In fact, I just recently had a discussion with a Chinese student about what the color red means for her, and it doesn't at all mean what it means for me. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to advance there. Keyboard accessibility is a very big issue for students with physical disabilities who cannot use a mouse. So instead, they're using the keyboard for all of their access. If you want to know how difficult it is to access everything in a course just using your keyboard, try it for about an hour. If it doesn't drive you crazy, then you're a better person than I, because it is very, very difficult. And people who who don't use a mouse, who are used to using the keyboard, are much faster and at it, and are better at it, of course, than someone like a novice like myself. But the point is that it's very difficult to make everything keyboard accessible. So you really need to pay attention to what the HTML might have to be, or how to use different styles so that shortcuts can be used, that someone who's using a keyboard only would be accessible to. I also want to say about someone who uses a screen reader. We learned so much from Gabe, the young man who worked with us on this project, because he could use a screen reader so quickly. But when a page or a document was poorly constructed, it frustrated him to no end. And that is a very shocking piece of knowledge, that we had created something that was going to frustrate students. And I think seeing that firsthand, if you ever have a chance to try to use a screen reader yourself, or to watch a student who's very adept at using a screen reader, can really open your eyes. Alternative text is what we use when we're trying to explain graphs and charts that are not, again, accessible using a screen reader. That can take a lot of effort to think about those in a different way, and frequently faculty rely on lots of graphs and charts. And so we really have to work closely with them to be sure that we're capturing the essence of what they're trying to convey with that, that visual, and be sure that we can explain it in narrative form so that it makes sense. And we also want to use alt text when we're talking about images in a course, because again, a screen reader cannot read an image. And so we need like a photograph. So we need to be sure that we're also using alt text when the photograph or the image that we're using has meaning and conveys meaning in the content, so that students are also have access to that material. Captioning. Captioning is, I get lots of questions about captioning, and there are two schools of thought about this. One is that if you have a transcript of a video, that's sufficient to provide access to the information in the video for the student. However, there's another school of thought that says a really well-captioned video, like the captioning that you see if you have closed captioning on your television turned on, provides more than just the text or the narrative. It also provides background sounds and size and other things that convey meaning. So a well-captioned video is useful to students who are relying on that alone to get their information. Now, captioning can be expensive, but there are lots of third-party providers that are captioning these days, and it's getting less and less expensive all the time. YouTube does have a captioning service that's free. Unfortunately, it's not perfect. So if you're going to post something to YouTube in a course, what you'd like to do, what you should do is go through the captioning to correct any errors that have been made when it's been automatically generated. Captions are not just useful to students who have hearing difficulties. They are also extremely useful to students whose language is not, the first language is not English. I have lots of students in graduate school who love downloading the transcripts or printing out the captions in order to have something to read. And maybe that's instead of watching the video, I don't know, but I think captioning really, that's an area that will help a lot of students that you might not necessarily think about. I just talked about transcripts and why those are important. At Pitt Online, when we're working with faculty who are creating videos for their courses, we ask them to submit transcripts. We also caption our videos, but having both is really the best of all worlds. And we are just now through our second year of captioning, and once you've done it, you don't have to do it again. That cost, that upfront cost is high, but it's a big payoff for students who require it. Creating accessible tables it takes a lot of effort because, again, it's an organizational issue and a content issue. So it's very important to work with faculty members in order to make sure that you're creating a table that is accessible and conveys the information that the faculty hope to convey. Any questions about any of that? I know I'm going through this pretty quickly, so I want to be sure that if you have questions, you have an opportunity to ask them. Please just stop me. If you just type in the chat, I will see it. As I said, ELI said that accessibility and universal design for learning would be two really big issues in the upcoming year and into the future, I think. So I thought I'd touch base just in a very general way on what universal design for learning means and how it relates to what we're talking about as far as accessibility. The most important thing, I think, to think about is that universal design for learning is the preemptive or proactive way of creating materials for educational purposes that are accessible. And that because we're not in this method, we're not necessarily concentrating on just students with disabilities, but all students, all people. That's an important issue. Just as a curb cut is an advantage for a mother with a stroller or an elderly person with a walker, as well as someone who uses a wheelchair. Those physical attributes of our physical world and space that we live in and work in and play in have impacts that sometimes we can't predict. And that's what universal design for learning is all about. It really is thinking about how these principles can benefit everyone, not just a specific population. So there are three principles that universal design for learning is based on. The first being using multiple means of representation, or the what of learning. And we've heard this a lot, but you really do need to consider it when creating materials for online, for creating materials in your classroom. What we're talking about is multimodal delivery of content. So some students want to download the transcript and read instead of watching the video. Some students want to be able to watch the video more than once. They'd like to be able to watch the video lecture all the way through for the 10 or 15 minutes that it runs, and then go back and listen again and again and again. Providing multiple methods of presenting the information gets to a lot more students than just one main way of presenting information, either in the classroom face-to-face or online. The second principle is provide multiple means of action and expression, or the how of learning. So what we're talking about here is, how do we ask students to convey that they understand the material? Are we only testing and quizzing? Or are we only asking them to write papers? Or are we doing projects? Are we doing small group work? Are we requiring students to come up with their own activity to demonstrate their knowledge? All of those examples are part of the second principle of universal design for learning. And the third principle is providing multiple means of engagement. And that really has to do with the use of active learning and other means of student participation. How do you motivate students to participate in the classroom? And what kinds of motivation works for one kind of student and not for another? You need to think about all of those things when creating your online course, or even when you're providing materials online or face-to-face, excuse me. So Marco asks, should we require students to provide a transcript of their presentations? I would say yes. Either require a transcript or captioning. And again, YouTube captions for free, but they should look at it to be sure that it's clear. If the student, for example, has a heavy accent, that can be problematic for any transcriber. But for an automated transcriber like the one that YouTube uses, it really becomes a jumble. Or if you're using a lot of jargon, that can also really mess up the translation. But at the very least, a transcript should be required. Students should get into the habit of providing that kind of additional material for others. Now, of course, for students, that's going to look like an additional step to take. But if you provide the rationale for why it's important and how it might help other students in the classroom, they are much more likely to do it than if you just say, I need you to provide a transcript for every presentation that you're doing or every video. This slide, it comes right from CAST, which is the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And it has great examples on it and ways of thinking about providing for the physical space, or options for sustaining effort and persistence, which we want to encourage in our students, thinking outside the box, and ways to activate and supply background knowledge, ways to highlight patterns, support planning and strategy. All of those things come into play when you're talking about universal design. And more and more universities are using this approach in order to meet the needs of the widest variety of students that they're seeing. One thing about students with disabilities, and I don't know if this is true at your university, but I assume that it is, the student has to self-identify to disability services in order for them to have recommendations made for adaptations in the classroom or online. And some students just don't want to do that. Some students don't understand how to advocate for themselves. Some students are still embarrassed, especially if you're talking about a mental illness or, having to provide extra time for an exam can make students feel very self-conscious. So although we know that about 11% of our students identify as having some kind of disability, the potential number is much greater than that. And so using universal design is one of the ways that we can help students who do not necessarily identify as disabled or who don't have English as their first language, or who are first generation students and need more supports than other students. There are lots of good reasons for using this approach, and I've seen it be very successful, both for instructors in thinking about how to approach material and also for students. So that's the end of my slideshow. I'd love to hear from some of you about questions that you have about any of this material, about accessibility, how to make something accessible or universal design. Any questions? For an online course, how do you assess engagement by individual students? That's a good question, and it's a common one. I struggle with that in my courses because a lot of engagement is not transferable through an online course as it is from a face-to-face lecture. So my question would be, what are you doing to assess engagement right now? And what kind of course do you teach? So the content does make a difference. For example, in a law course that I work on right now, this is a graduate certificate program in healthcare compliance, and the students are required mostly to communicate using the discussion board, and they must post an original post before they are able to see anyone else's posts, and that's what the faculty member grades on. However, they are also required to discourse among one another. And in that way, you can see how engaged students are with the content and where they're getting hung up, if they are, on certain material. I think one of the most important things we can do online is some formative assessments throughout the semester. So quick quizzes that allow students at very low stakes to gauge how lost they really are and whether or not they need to go back and look at a video or read a chapter out of a text again. And it also helps faculty to see where they might be falling down as far as explaining material, because if all of the students are missing the same questions on the quiz, it indicates either it's not a well-written question, or I really didn't explain that well, so I need to go back and review that material again so that students can catch up. But I think using quizzes and other self-assessment techniques are the best way to assess engagement for individual students online. Thank you for that question. Marco asks, have you noticed any LMS that is better at providing this type of accessibility? Well, the thing about the LMSs is that Blackboard, Moodle, Canvas, D2L, they will all tell you that everything about the way they've built their LMS is accessible. What you have to worry about is what you're putting in the LMS. So if you're loading documents, or if you have a syllabus and a schedule and you have content that you're adding to the LMS, it's on you to make sure that that material is accessible. Stanley asks, many online students are not local and have no interaction with SCC prior to enrolling in the online course. With local students who need accommodations, we receive notice of the accommodations from SCC counselors. How do the outside students provide us requests for accommodations? Those students should also contact whoever your online or your face-to-face students contact about needing accommodations. So your counselors, your disability services folks, whoever it is, those students, that should be part of your syllabus so that students off campus who never come to campus know who they need to get in touch with if they need accommodations in the course. I have discussion boards and students talk through that. I give weekly quizzes online and give exams every 2 weeks for assessment. I teach human anatomy, so a lot of it is memorization material. Yeah, just answering your questions to me. Okay, yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're doing the right things. Yeah, I'd be curious to take a look at your course and see what you're doing, because I do think engagement is hard to gauge online, but after you've been doing it for a while, you kind of get some tricks and tips up your sleeve about how to do that. Laura, thank you, Marco. It's a pleasure. Please contact me if you have further questions. I'm happy to discuss any of this information with anyone. If after you've had a chance to look at the slides yourselves, if there's more information that you want or need, I'm happy to provide it. I have lots and lots of references on accessibility and some really good websites that are available, journal articles that have been written and research that's been done. I'm happy to share any and all of that with anyone who's interested. So thank you. Any further questions? I know I'm tying things up here a little early, but I wanted to make sure that I left plenty of time for all of these questions, because people usually have a bunch. I want to thank Stephanie again for inviting me, and you've been great, a great audience, and I appreciate your time. I know you're busy people, so thank you. Thank you very much.